Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're diving deep into Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking.
Ooh, very interesting choice.
Yeah, it's been on my list for a while,
Oh, I love that one.
and it's all about those like split-second decisions,
Uh-huh.
those thin slicing moments
Yes, thin slicing.
where you kind of size up a situation or a person.
Right, or like when you hear a song and instantly know it'll be a hit.
Exactly. It's like our brains are making these crazy fast judgments with barely any information.
And what's wild is that they're often surprisingly accurate, even when we can't explain why.
Right. Like, how is that even possible? So Gladwell dives into all this fascinating research, and he kicks it off with his psychologist, John Gottman, who he studies relationships.
Okay, interesting.
And get this, he claims he can predict divorce with like over 90% accuracy.
Wow, 90% from what, though?
Just by watching a couple argue for a few minutes.
Seriously, just a few minutes.
That's all it takes. Apparently, those first few minutes are super revealing.
I guess I can see that.
But he's not just listening to what they're saying. He's looking for these tiny cues.
Like what kind of cues?
Like a fleeting expression of contempt, or a tense shift in body language.
So it's more about the nonverbal stuff.
Exactly. The tone of voice, the way they're holding themselves, it all adds up.
So it's like he's learned to decode this secret language of relationships.
Right. He's picking up on these subtle signals that most of us miss completely.
It makes you wonder what we're overlooking in our own relationship.
Totally. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, this thin slicing thing. It's not just relationships.
So where else does it show up?
Gladwell takes us all over the place, showing how it pops up in like the most unexpected situations.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, there's this study by psychologist Samuel Gosling where he had people judge someone's personality just by looking at their dorm room.
You're kidding. Their dorm room.
Yeah. And they were incredibly accurate, like predicting traits like extroversion, conscientiousness.
So basically, our stuff says a lot about who we are.
Exactly. It's like our personalities leave fingerprints on our surroundings.
That's both cool and kind of creepy at the same time.
Right. Makes you think twice about your own living space,
Seriously, I need to tidy up.
But wait, it gets even crazier. They did a study where they could predict which surgeons were more likely to get sued for malpractice
Hold on. How did they do that?
just by listening to their tone of voice.
No way. You're messing with me.
I'm serious. They used these 40-second audio clips stripped of all content so you couldn't tell what they were saying.
And just from the tone, they could predict lawsuits.
Yep. Apparently, something about the way they spoke, some underlying quality, was a giveaway.
So it's not just what we say, it's how we say it.
Exactly. It's like our inner selves are kind of leaking out through these subtle cues, even when we think we're being totally neutral.
It's a bit unnerving when you think about it.
Definitely makes you wonder what you're projecting out into the world.
Yeah, it's a good reminder to be mindful of those subtle signals.
Totally. But here's the thing. This thin slicing, it's not foolproof.
So it can backfire sometimes.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And Gladwell uses this example of Warren G. Harding, the U.S. president.
Oh, yeah, what about him?
Well, he's a prime example of when thin slicing goes wrong. He was basically elected because he looked the part.
He was a handsome dude, wasn't he? Like super charismatic.
Exactly. But turns out his presidency was a complete disaster.
Full of scandals and stuff.
Yeah. It's like people got so caught up in his looks and charm, they overlooked his lack of qualifications.
So it's like we associate certain physical traits with positive qualities, even if it's not true.
Right. Like height, attractiveness. We unconsciously connect those with competence and leadership.
It's like our brains are playing tricks on us, filling in the blanks with assumptions.
And those biases can have real consequences, not just in elections, but in everyday life.
Like in job interviews or even just social interactions.
Exactly. It's a good reminder to be wary of those first impressions.
So how do we avoid making these snap judgments, these Warren Harding errors?
That's the million-dollar question. And Gladwell explores this tension throughout the book, using this really interesting story of Paul Van Riper.
Paul Van Riper, who's that?
He's this retired Marine Corps colonel who basically challenged the whole way the military thinks.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So he was involved in this massive war game, Millennium Challenge 2002, where he played the enemy commander.
Oh, wow. A war game. Sounds intense.
It was supposed to be a test for the U.S. military's new high-tech data-driven approach to warfare.
So it was all about using algorithms and intel to make decisions.
Exactly. And Van Riper was the underdog, with limited resources, going up against the full might of the U.S. military.
So it was like a David and Goliath situation.
Totally. But here's the thing. Instead of playing by the book, following the patterns the U.S. military had programmed into their computers,
He went rogue.
he went completely rogue, used unconventional tactics, rapid decision-making, a lot of gut instinct.
So he relied on his intuition.
And it totally threw off the U.S. forces. They were expecting him to behave a certain way, and he just completely flipped the script.
That's awesome. So what happened?
In the early stages of the war game, Van Riper's forces completely decimated the U.S. forces.
Wow, seriously. He beat them.
Yeah. It was a huge wake-up call for the military establishment.
So what's the takeaway from that?
That sometimes overthinking can lead to paralysis, while trusting your instincts can lead to breakthroughs.
So it's about finding the right balance between data and intuition.
Exactly. And Gladwell emphasizes this with a story about a firefighter who made this split-second decision to evacuate his team from a burning building.
Sounds like a dangerous situation.
Oh, yeah, but he couldn't even explain why he felt they had to get out. It was pure intuition.
And it saved their lives.
It did. It was like there was this deeper wisdom at play, this unconscious knowledge that guided him to the right decision.
It makes you wonder how much of our decision-making is based on things we can't even articulate.
Right. And how we can learn to trust that inner voice more.
Yeah, it's a fascinating interplay between the conscious and unconscious mind.
Definitely makes you think about how much is going on beneath the surface of our awareness all the time.
Well, on that note, maybe we should take a little break and come back to this fascinating conversation about the interplay between conscious and unconscious thinking.
Sounds good to me. We'll be back soon to keep exploring Blink and all its mind-bending insights. Okay, so we've seen this thin slicing in relationships and even life or death situations. But now Gladwell takes us into this whole other realm.
Oh, yeah, part two.
The world of taste and preference. And this is where things get really interesting. How do we know what we like?
It is kind of a mystery, isn't it?
Gladwell introduces us to this guy, Kenna, a musician who is struggling to make it big.
Oh, I think I've heard of him.
Yeah, and he was getting all this praise from industry experts. They were raving about his music.
So what was the problem?
The problem was that the general public just wasn't feeling it.
Oh, so the experts loved him, but nobody else did?
Exactly. And when they did market research, his music scored really low.
Ouch, that's gotta hurt.
Yeah, it's a classic example of the experts being out of touch with the average person's taste.
I guess it makes sense, though. Taste is so subjective.
Totally. How do you even explain why you like a certain song? It's just a feeling, right?
Exactly. You just know it when you hear it.
But then Gladwell contrasts this with professional food tasters,
These people with, super refined palates.
Exactly. They've trained their senses to the point where they can dissect flavors and textures with, insane precision.
It's almost like a superpower.
And what's interesting is that they can actually articulate the reasons behind their preferences.
So they're not just saying, I like this. They can explain why.
Right. They can tell you why one chocolate is better than another or why a certain wine has a specific aftertaste.
So it's like they've bridged that gap between the unconscious and conscious. They're aware of those subtle nuances.
It makes you wonder if we could all train ourselves to be more aware of those reasons behind our snap judgments.
It would be pretty cool to tap into that thin slicing part of our brains and understand it better.
But Gladwell doesn't stop there. He takes us even deeper into this idea of mind reading.
Hold on, mind reading. Are we talking about actual telepathy?
Huh, not quite. But it's still pretty wild. It's about how we understand other people's thoughts and feelings through nonverbal cues.
Oh, right, like body language and facial expression.
Exactly. And it turns out our brains are really good at decoding those signals. We're constantly picking up on subtle cues from the people around us.
So we're all kind of like amateur mind readers in a way.
In a way, yeah. But if we're so good at it, why do we still have so many misunderstandings?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, Gladwell gets into that too, exploring those times when our mind-reading abilities fail us.
And when does that happen?
He uses this really powerful example, the case of Amadou Diallo. Remember that?
Oh, yeah, the unarmed black man who was shot by police officers.
It was a tragic case, and it sparked a lot of debate about racial profiling and police brutality.
So how does that tie into mind reading?
Gladwell suggests that the officers involved might have experienced something called temporary mind blindness.
Temporary mind blindness.
It's this idea that stress, fear, and even prejudice can cloud our judgment and make it hard to accurately read social cues.
So in a high-pressure situation like what those officers faced, their brains might have basically short-circuited.
It's a chilling thought that our ability to mind read could be temporarily shut down like that.
And it makes you wonder what other situations might trigger this kind of mind blindness.
Right. Like, are we all susceptible to it under certain circumstances?
And Gladwell takes it a step further, drawing a parallel between this temporary mind blindness and the experiences of people with autism, because they often struggle with social cues, right?
Exactly. It's a bold comparison, but the point is that our mind-reading abilities aren't perfect.
They can be affected by all sorts of things, and when they go haywire, it can have serious consequences.
It's a good reminder to be aware of our own limitations, to not jump to conclusions based solely on our gut feelings.
Especially when it comes to something as complex as human behavior.
But Gladwell doesn't leave us hanging. He offers a way to mitigate those snap judgments and unconscious biases.
Really? What's that?
He talks about blind auditions in the world of classical music.
Interesting. So the musicians are behind a screen.
Exactly. And it turns out that when orchestras started doing this, the number of women hired skyrocketed.
Wow. So by removing the visual element, they basically eliminated the bias.
It's amazing how something so simple can make such a big difference.
It makes you think what other areas of life could benefit from this kind of blind screen approach.
It's a great question to ponder, and it leads us into the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore how to become more aware of our own biases and make more objective judgments. Okay, so we're back, and we've gone pretty deep into Gladwell's Blink.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
From those super fast judgments to mind reading and all the ways things can go wrong.
It's really made me think about how much is going on beneath the surface, you know?
Right, all that unconscious stuff driving our decisions.
But Gladwell doesn't just leave us with all these mind-blowing insights. He actually gives us some tools to work with.
So how do we harness the power of thin slicing without falling prey to all those biases?
Well, he wraps up the book by talking about how to make the most of those crucial first 2 seconds.
So it's not about ignoring our intuition, it's about using it wisely.
Exactly. It's finding that balance between instinct and conscious thinking.
He tells this great story about Bob Galam, that car salesman who could read people like a book.
Oh yeah, he was amazing. Like, he could close any deal.
But the thing is, he also knew how easily biases could sneak in, so he developed this whole system to keep himself in check.
So he didn't just rely on his gut, he had a process.
Right. He wouldn't let himself make assumptions about customers based on how they looked or acted.
So he created his own blind screen to block out those biases.
Exactly. And it worked. He was super successful.
Yeah. And this brings up a key point that Gladwell makes about editing our thin slicing, you know?
Editing. What do you mean by that?
Like, when we make those snap judgments, our brains are filtering information, deciding what's important and what's not.
So it's like our minds are trying to make sense of chaos, finding the signal in the noise.
Right. But that filtering process can be flawed.
So we might focus on the wrong things or miss crucial details.
Exactly. And that's where the editing comes in. We need to be more aware of what we're paying attention to.
And how do we do that?
Well, first, we got to acknowledge that we all have biases, you know?
Nobody's immune.
Our experiences shape how we see the world, so it's inevitable.
But once we admit that, we can start to notice those biases and how they might be affecting us.
It's about becoming more self-aware, more mindful.
But it's probably hard to do that on our own, right? We need other people to point out our blind spots.
Totally. Surrounding ourselves with diverse perspectives is so important.
If everyone around you agrees with you all the time, you're probably missing something.
It's like that saying, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
We need to be constantly learning and growing, challenging our assumptions.
And that's really what Gladwell's getting at in Blink, this idea that our minds are capable of both brilliance and blunders.
So by understanding how thin slicing works, both the good and the bad, we can become better decision makers.
More mindful, more discerning, more open to new information.
This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. Makes you think twice about those gut feelings.
It's fascinating how much goes on beneath the surface, right?
And kind of humbling, too.
But ultimately, I think it's empowering.
Because the more we understand about our minds, the better we can navigate the world around us.
Exactly. We can make more informed choices, less biased judgments.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Blink, I'm left with this question for everyone listening. How can we become more aware of our own biases and make those snap judgments work for us, not against us? It's definitely something I'll be pondering, and I hope our listeners will too. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the power of thinking without thinking.